Well, thank you very much for being here. So here's the question: how do we balance quality versus the cost of an education? And we have a simple goal, and it makes sense as a public institution to have a mission which is to provide the highest possible quality education at a cost that still ensures access by the citizens in this Commonwealth and the nation and increasingly the world. So we have a lot of signs of excellence. We have many things that I can go on the road with and brag about just how great Penn State is. People vote with their feet. We had a record number of applications to enter Penn State. Last year, 131,000 individuals wrote applications to come here as freshmen. And that applicant pool and admission set was the highest quality on record. This year, we're right at that same record quality, and we're between number 1 and number 2 in terms of the highest number of applications received by the university. This tells you that the world out there values a Penn State education. More than $800 million in research expenditures, ranks us in the top 20 in total research expenditures. This is a sign that your faculty are extremely competitive in writing proposals and getting grants. A mediocre faculty member isn't going to receive those dollars. A great faculty member is. If we take even a subset of that, and we say science, technology, engineering, mathematics, the STEM fields, and we look at the amount of funding that we bring in terms of the number of disciplines that we had in the top 10 in funding, we had 12 areas. That placed us second in the nation. We were tied with MIT, and I sort of kid around and say, I hear they're a pretty good school. But they're tied with Penn State in terms of science, technology, engineering. Well, this is MIT's strength. And there's Penn State right there within that. This is a sign of extraordinary excellence in these set of fields. Our World Campus, second year in a row, ranked as number 1 in delivery of a baccalaureate program, also number 1 for veterans. As a matter of fact, this year, the World Campus got a perfect score. 176,000 alumni wrote checks in the last capital campaign, creating 91,000 new scholarships. If an alum gives money back, if they're willing to pull out their checkbook and hand you dollars, that's a sign that they valued what their education was. We also know that we had a record number of applications. Just the fall career fair alone brought in over 500 companies recruiting students from Penn State. And the companies tell us over and over again just how much they value a Penn State student. Over and over, these big companies are narrowing their recruiting list to just a handful of schools, 5 or 6 schools. Penn State always seems to be on their list. Great students, critical thinkers, good communication skills, and above all else, a great work ethic that you're willing to go out there and work. And so they want Penn Staters. So we got a lot of signs of excellence that are there. And if we look at the rankings, we're in the top 1% of the world. So all of this tells me there's a very strong value proposition being here at Penn State. Now, I just bragged about the excellence. What about the cost? So if we look at our total institution budget first, and we see tuition and fees, hospital, clinic, auxiliary enterprises, restricted funds, state appropriations, you can see that we have a relatively low state appropriation of 5.7%. And we think about this pie chart, the hospital and clinical operation has to stand on its own. If they lose money, they better cover it. If they make a little money, they save it for construction or something else. Auxiliary enterprises are like housing and food services. We demand that they break even and that no tuition dollar crosses over in either of those two categories. Restricted funds, like a research grant from the feds, we can only spend it on what we told the federal government we would spend the dollar on. If we have a donor who gives dollars for a program, it can only be spent on that program. So when you look at what can be put into an educational budget, it's only in 2 blocks, tuition and fees and the state appropriation. These 2 blocks are basically the educational and operational budget of Penn State University. Now, if we look at the state appropriations, we take one part of that pie chart, you can see how that has evolved through time. These are years in which there was a recession. We had to give money back. The yellow was stimulus funds due to the recession. So now if you were looking at that blue line of what's happened to Penn State in terms of funding and realize that this is a recession, we gave money back, we have been pretty flat for a large number of years, very close to zero increases in state appropriation. If I just say, what would the world be like if this number had continued, we would have had $1.5 billion more to invest in a Penn State education if the state of Pennsylvania had just kept track of 07-08 as an appropriation year and continued that number throughout the years that followed. That tells you how significant those dollars are and how significant a cut in a state appropriation is to the success of Penn State. Many institutions over the last 10 years have described the appropriation from their states as publics as eventually being tuition-driven as opposed to state appropriation-driven. So when the majority of your educational budget is funded by student tuition, you're a tuition-driven university. Now, the interesting thing is that most of these schools across the nation, in the last 10 years, they became tuition-driven, where the tuition accounted for more of the educational budget than the state appropriation. The interesting thing about Penn State is that this happened for us in 82, 83. We're really talking about more than 30 years ago. Penn State became a tuition-driven institution rather than a state appropriation-driven institution. We've been at this for a long time, and it basically stems from the fact of what Pennsylvania's decisions about contributions for funding might be. Now, you can ask yourself, okay, that's fine, the state appropriation is less, our tuition ends up to be higher. The biggest explanation for tuition growth over the last 20 years is changes in state appropriations around the country. Inflation's a factor. There's some other factors that are in there as well. But how do we compare with our peers? And so the best peer that we can sit here and look at and think through this is to focus on the Big Ten. These are big public universities. They're the flagships for their states. We're a flagship for the state of Pennsylvania. So let's look at it as a comparison. So here's Penn State sitting here, and this is a University of Virginia survey. So we're talking about quite a while ago. The situation has gotten worse, not better. So here's Penn State's state appropriation per student. I take all of you and divide it into the amount of state appropriation. This is a state appropriation per student. Look at the state appropriations up here for these institutions. And as a consequence, we make up the difference in tuition and fees in order for us to be competitive. There's the average excluding Penn State University. And we are below average in the amount of money we have to spend on you to promote a strong educational program. If I go back really quickly, that year that I'm talking about is this one. But now if I were to make the same calculation, I would be using this number. So this tells you that this picture has gotten worse because this number is smaller by a significant amount than it was before. And as a consequence, this number in tuition and fees has gone up, plus there's inflation and several other factors there. The interesting thing also is that we have the lowest state appropriation. We have a below average amount of money that we get to spend on you and your education, but yet we're in the top quarter of the ranking within the Big Ten. So we're in the bottom half. We're actually the top of the bottom third in the amount of money we have to spend, and we're in the top quarter in the quality. So you could actually graph this if you wanted to, same year that we're talking about, and this is the total amount of money we have to spend per student. This is our rank among publics. Anybody that's above that line spends a lot more money per student and yet doesn't generate as much quality as we do. Anybody below this line is generating quality above the average amount of resources that we have. So there's Penn State sitting there. High quality institution, and actually only 3 schools that have less money per student than we do. So this should tell us that we're actually fairly efficient in delivering quality for you. Okay, where does your tuition dollar and appropriation dollar go? This sort of divides it up. And that's interesting, isn't it? So it's good to have this in words, okay? So where does your tuition and appropriation go? Well, 43% is in faculty salaries, benefits, associated class. That's instruction. 20% the academic support, like libraries and IT and course development. Student services, admissions, registrar, health services, student aid, that's university-generated scholarships and fellowships, not from donations. There's teaching within this. And if you come right down to it, all those dollars go to support student activities, except 15% is what it takes for us to do administrative functions, payroll, police, fiscal operations, and fundraising, and 10% buildings and grounds maintenance. And otherwise, there's 3% that's additional support for research. So basically, the lion's share of those dollars that are state appropriated or that come from your tuition dollar in one way or another touch students. Okay, it's not the only factor when you think about costs. So I'll just give you a couple of examples. The highest cost I can think of is to borrow money, pay tuition, and not graduate. That's the greatest tragedy that I can imagine. That's a very expensive Penn State experience. We can't afford that. Second major factor is the length of time it takes you to get your degree. So we may sit there and look at what the state's done and look at healthcare costs and look at all these other factors, and we may add $400 to a tuition bill. But if you add $17,000 plus housing and food service to your tuition bill by going an extra year, that is by far the most expensive tuition increase that you can possibly imagine. The best way to save money is to graduate on time. The third part is to focus on borrowing, and we have some of our peers that are experimenting with this by telling you, here's when you'll pay it back, you'll be 42 years old, and here's the payment you'll have until age 42. And their borrowing dropped at one university by $30 million in a single year. Incidentally, that's $30 million a year that they attribute to lifestyle borrowing. And going years 5 and 6, every class in this room borrows an extra $25 million to go years 5 and 6. So this tells you how important it is, stay in school, keep your foot on the gas, graduate in 4 or less. That's an enormous cost saver that goes way beyond what the actual cost of tuition is. Okay, so here's my pitch. We provide high-quality education, top 1% in the world, highly ranked public university, and we do it on less dollars than our peers have. And unfortunately, that's a small state appropriation and a large tuition number. We have an obligation to you to ensure a very high quality for your degree. I promise you that we have to keep this quality picture up for as long as you live and beyond, because nobody's going to come up to you when you're 45 years old and say, how good was Penn State when you were there? They will only have in their mind what the quality of Penn State is today. No one's going to sit there and say, in a job interview, how good was the football team? They're only going to look at the quality of Penn State today. And that's why we have an obligation to maintain a top 1% of the world education throughout time, well into the future. And you're going to have to watch and make sure that we do our job and that you have that high degree. You'll talk about some of these things around the water fountain, but when you're out there looking at a job or you're talking with somebody else or you're trying to sit there and talk to a potential customer, what Penn State is on that day is what Penn State will be to those individuals, and we have to maintain that high quality. Well, we don't want to be done yet. We can't just sit here. That's a message that we can't just sit here. And our view is strategically we have to think about 3 major things. One is our doors have to be open. They have to be open to hardworking, capable students. And we know right now that we graduate students far above what's predicted based on the economic capability of our students. But we have a whole lot of need-based students who don't graduate at that same high 86% level. We have to fix that problem. A great public needs to look at their student body and say, I don't care what you look like, what your financial capability is like, what your history is, we're going to deliver a great degree on time without you taking extra years to do it. We need to make sure we have a transformative education for you. And there are really two areas for which we feel like we have to do a lot more. One is to give you a global view. That international perspective will serve you throughout your lives. And the second is the digital revolution is just roaring along. It hasn't stopped. We have to make sure that you are leaders in that endeavor, not people that are just trying to keep pace or behind pace. And finally, we have to focus more on topics that matter to society. Human health, water, energy, and food security defined by abundance, affordable, safe. Getting our ideas into the marketplace with things like Invent Penn State. And a focus on the arts and humanities because this is the way that we deal and understand social problems. So here is my summary. You have a remarkably strong institution that you're attending. This institution is growing stronger. The applications tell us that. The companies here to recruit tell us that. We have a group of new initiatives that we will believe will make us stronger still. We do have some challenges promoting our excellence out there in the world. We do have significant problems with access and affordability because that state appropriation is low enough that our tuition is too high. It's just too high. We need it in order to promote quality. We promote that quality and the dollars we have more efficiently than do other institutions, but that balance between state appropriation and tuition is not right, in my opinion. And uncertainty and delays in the state appropriation are creating even greater challenges for us to maintain this level of quality and focus on the future. So with that, I thank you very much for being here listening, and I look forward to hearing the other speakers that are about to follow. Thank you very much.